going to get introduced to in just a minute is here this Sunday and then next, and we'll talk more about that because next Sunday we'll be kind of processing and what do we do with the information we've heard today. So this is all under the banner of public church. We've talked about a number of issues and social issues, and some of them were controversial, some of them not. Everything from immigration to economic life, human sexuality we talked about last week. Well, this goes back to that economic life and our call as Christians to make a difference in the world. How do we make an impact in helping others with their physical, emotional, spiritual needs, looking at the whole person? And this church is very committed to that. I know one of our former mission statements was, in Christ, people caring for people. That's a beautiful statement. So our speaker is going to help us think about that. And so this event is happening under that banner. The only other announcement I have for you is just for you to start thinking, put it on your long-term radar, that our Lay School of Theology this year that happens the middle part of April is going to be on congregational size and dynamics and systems. This is all worked into my sabbatical, which I'll be going on towards the end of May. And the grant I got for that sabbatical was titled Long-Term Pastor Booster and Size Barrier Buster. So part of this is to say Silverdale Lutheran's a vibrant, dynamic, amazing congregation, but we have been at our similar size ever since we moved up here in this location, and I'm wanting to start a conversation about what might it mean for us to be to move past this ceiling. Do we want to do that? What would it mean if we do? And so our Lay School of Theology speaker is going to be helping us with that. So with that, without further ado, I think the best way, since I got exposed to the wonderful research that our speaker is going to bring to us today from my beloved spouse, I am going to introduce Sandy Gessler-Crabtree, who is a director at the Educational Services District, and she's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you for remembering where I work. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sandy and I am married to Pastor Bill, and my life has been dedicated to public education as a teacher in the classroom and a principal, and now as a director for professional learning for teachers and administrators. So at the ESD, which is the Educational Service District, which serves all 15 school districts on the Kitsap and the Olympic Peninsulas, we are always looking at the heart and the mind of teaching. And so it was my pleasure to get introduced to Kody Russell, who came to Kitsap County on a grant, and maybe he'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the grant is called Kitsap Strong, and a group of other directors got me involved in this because, truthfully, we cannot nourish the minds of kids until their hearts and their bodies are well taken care of. And there's been a lot of research, wonderful neuroscience research, in the past decade or two that leads us to different conclusions about what causes kids to do well, what causes kids to be resilient, and what causes kids to really struggle. And so when I started working with this, I just, truthfully, Kitsap Strong, the alliance that we put together for Collaborative Learning Academy, there were other churches involved, and I just came running home to Bill and I said, Silverdale Lutheran should be here. This is just such what we need. And we just need to understand this. So he got an earful, and then I connected the two, and so that's why Kody's here today. ACEs is an amazing, it's a penultimate type of discussion now because of the neuroscience, the epigenetics, what we know about how we're raised, and how no matter how many ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, somebody experiences, they can still turn out great as long as they have factors that protect them. And a lot of times we talk about resiliency. But guess what? Church is one of those factors. Church can be a huge factor in a child's upbringing to protect them from the negative impacts other things have on their lives. So I know that that's been a benefactor in my life, being raised in a Lutheran church. I also have a wonderful role model in my mom, Laura Gessner, who had probably 5 or 6 ACEs when she was growing up, and yet she was resilient, and the Holy Spirit led her into a wonderful life that she's been able to give back in so many ways. So she's my hero, but I wanted to tell you that I have a live example of what resiliency and what good factors can do for children. So I knew this would speak to your heart. It spoke to my heart when I first got introduced to it. And at the ESD, we're still thinking about how to get this word out. Because schools aren't going to be able to do what they need to do until we have a better understanding of this. And I know how impactful a church can be on a child's upbringing. So without further ado, it really is my honor to introduce Kody Russell, who came to Kitsap County just to do this work. So I think that's just truly a wonderful life gift that he's given a lot of people. So please put your hands together for Kody. You're going to learn a lot today.
Thank you so much. Is the mic volume okay? Everybody can? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. This is an honor and a pleasure to be here, participating and facilitating this conversation with you today. This is a conversation about, and Sandy summarized it, right? This is a conversation about community and about compassion. It talks about trauma, but that's just part of the story. And really the story is about community and the power of community. I've spent the last 10 years working with children and families that have experienced really, really profound trauma. I spent 3 years working in a group home for children who had been sexually abused and then who had acted out sexually with another child. And my experience there made me think, hey, you know what, I gotta get upstream of this. Most of those kids have been involved in Child Protective Services numerous times. And so I went to the work at Child Protective Services. So I spent the last 7 years working in Child Protective Services doing investigations and licensing foster homes. And then in the last 3 years, I was a family team decision meeting facilitator. So here in Washington State, thankfully, we have some great trauma-informed work, which requires that we have a meeting with the family, as many people as that parent identifies as being their family, their support network. And oftentimes it was members of their community, their congregation, their church if they were involved. They would bring them to the meeting, and we were required by law to have a conversation anytime we're talking about moving a child from their birth parents into another home, anytime we're talking about returning a child back to their birth parents after they've been in foster care, or anytime a child moves from one foster home to another foster home. And my experience there really shaped my understanding of community, because what I saw was that it didn't really matter what was going on with mom and dad. They were all variations pretty similar. There was heroin use in this family, there was domestic violence in this family, there was substance use, alcoholism, there was physical abuse, sexual abuse going on over here. But what determined whether we could keep a child safe in that environment or not were the people at the table. The number of people that mom and dad could bring to the table with them determined whether we could make a safe plan to keep the kid there, right? Oftentimes we were able to come up with really, really creative plans. Auntie was going to move into the house, live there, take the kids to school, supervise them all during the day while mom and dad got themselves back into treatment, right? We were able to come up with those creative plans when there's community there. But when we had that family meeting, and it was just mom and dad, and oftentimes they're isolated because of the substance use, because of the domestic violence, because of the mental health issues, it's really hard to be creative and come up with a plan that focuses on what's really best for the child. So that's what brought me here to doing this work and focused on community, because I believe the most important thing for my son, who's 4 years old, is the community and the neighborhood that we live in, right? As a parent, I have this desire to protect him and never let him outside, right? That's how I know he'll be safe, is if he never leaves my arms, right? But that's not real, right? What kind of life is that, right? The bubble boy? I know that the best thing for him is the health of our next door neighbor. The best thing for him is the health of his best friend. And I don't know who his best friend's going to be, right? Because that's who he's going to call when he's 30 and has a question about parenting, right? I want him to call me, but I'm going to be the second phone call, right? Anybody here a parent? Anybody here knows that, right? Yeah. Anybody a grandparent? Yeah. You're usually not the first phone call. We want to be, and they'll eventually get around to us, and then they'll say, hey, you know what, you were right, right? So that's confirming. So before we get into this conversation, though, there's a couple of things logistical stuff, and then some basic concepts that I think we all need to understand for us to really get the most out of this information. The first is I passed around a bunch of trinket toys. There should be sign-in sheets at each table, and there should be an evaluation. So the group The community group that's paying me, the Kitsap Community Foundation, the Suquamish Tribe, the United Way of Kitsap County, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is really passionate about making this information accessible to the community. But part of that means that they want some level of accountability, that Kody isn't just sitting at home, talking to himself again, right? So if you will sign in, that helps to show that I'm taking this message out to the community, and the evaluation I really take seriously so that I can make this the best process possible, and so people can learn from this conversation. And the trinket toys are just to help you stay engaged. I'm an adult learner, right? So if you guys need your cell phones or whatever else, it doesn't bother me, it doesn't distract me. Whatever you need to do to stay present, that's fine with me. And please know that we're going to be talking about trauma. And so in order for us to have this conversation, the most important thing for me is that we're safe. And you guys know what you need to do to be safe. So focus on taking care of yourself today, right? So if you need to get up, walk around, stretch, that's highly encouraged, okay? All right, so some basic things before we jump into this, and then we're going to get the conversation rolling. There's two types of problems that we face in the world. The first is what they call a routine challenge. Right? And it has a process or a procedure for solving it, and there's an expert. Routine doesn't mean that it happens regularly, right? It just means that there's a routine for solving that problem. And these routine challenges can be really, really simple, like baking a cake. That's maybe simpler for some of you here in the audience because you're an expert than it is for me, right? But there is a process and a procedure for baking a cake. If you do it right, it turns out well. If you don't, well then, it doesn't taste very good, right? And it can be complex, right? Getting a rocket to the moon. Still a routine challenge, but it's complex and there's experts involved, right? We all know the routine process for if our house catches on fire, right? What do you guys do? Call 911, right? Even the kids in this congregation know the process for that. It's a routine challenge. Hopefully it doesn't happen routinely, right? Then you got something else going on in your house. The other type of challenge is what's called an adaptive challenge. And adaptive challenges are essentially the exact opposite of a routine challenge. There's no real process or procedure involved, and there's generally not really an expert. Can you guys think of what an adaptive challenge might be? Anything that you do that's an adaptive challenge? Yeah?
You lost your job?
Yeah, that could be something like that. Absolutely. Finding a new job. Divorce? Sure.
Car crash.
What?
Car crash.
Car crash. Yeah, that could be an adaptive challenge. Well, it can depend, right? Is that if you have the resources, a car crash can be a routine challenge, right? There's a number to call. You call AAA, they come if you get a flat tire, right? But if you don't have AAA, if you don't have a sense of community, that can become a very difficult challenge. So when I'm thinking of an adaptive challenge, I'm thinking of things like parenting, right? You can get really good at parenting, and you know what to do yesterday, and then this morning I woke up and nothing I used yesterday works today with my 4-year-old. Anybody else ever had that experience, right? Feels like it's a brand new day, right? Parenting is an adaptive challenge. Teaching is an adaptive challenge, right? You can get really good at teaching. My mom is a 30-year veteran of teaching. She just retired last year. She got really good at teaching, but each year was a new challenge and a new struggle because there were new students and she had to adapt the material to them, right? So adaptive challenges require learning. And the reason I'm starting off with this is that when I do this presentation, communities always want to know, what's the answer? How do we build resiliency, right? And sadly, the reality is that we're talking about an adaptive challenge. So this is how we create that answer. You guys coming together, continuing this conversation, learning, trying new things, that's how we change this situation, right? There is no expert on this. You can be an expert on understanding how trauma impacts the brain, but you can't be an expert on understanding what do we do now, because each individual is different. So we have to learn about that individual and figure out what they need and support them with their needs. And the other thing that I want to start us off with is a conversation, and then we'll roll, is this idea of mental models. Anybody ever heard the term mental models before? Sandy has, because she's been in my class. At least she raised her hand, that's a good sign, right? So mental models is this understanding that only about 30% of human behavior is what we see, right? Our decisions and choices. 70% is under the water. I keep using my body for this, I'm not sure it's a nice analogy. But the idea of an iceberg, right? 70% of the iceberg is underwater. What's driving our decisions in life is our deeply held beliefs and values and our assumptions, right? There's some quick mental models from our history, right? Anybody remember Columbus? Right? Before Columbus, what was the mental model? World's flat, right? And actually, if Columbus had known where he landed, that mental model may have continued, right? Because he didn't land in the Indies. He thought he had landed in the West Indies, right? But thankfully, and he obviously wasn't the first person either to make that voyage. But at that point, because enough people understood or believed the world to be round, it changed the entire existence, right? Another really important mental model from a public health perspective was during the cholera outbreaks, there was this man, a doctor named John Snow. Have you guys ever heard the story of John Snow? Yeah. So John Snow, not from our popular TV series right now, right? John Snow, during the cholera epidemic, the reigning mental model was this thing called miasma, dirty air. That's how you get sick, right? You breathe in dirty air and you're dying. That's what's causing that's what all this is about. So everybody's wearing masks and all of this sort of stuff, and people are still dying. He's treating repeated patients that are all drinking from the same well. And he thought, maybe there's something else going on here. And he went to the well, and of course, they had been dumping human waste, dead bodies, all kinds of things into this well, right? Because they were just getting rid of it, because they wanted to get the air to smell better, so they had to get all the waste away, right? Well, they were dumping it into the water that they drank. So he was like, this is not a good idea, right? I don't think it's the air that's making us sick, I think it's the water. And he told everyone. And that's how we got past the cholera epidemic, right? So these mental models drive our assumptions and our beliefs. And today we're having a conversation about our mental model around the impact of trauma. Right now we have a mental model about people that have mental health issues in our community. What are the words that we use for somebody who has mental health issues in our community? This is a safe place. Come on. What do we call them? Crazy, absolutely. What else?
Disturbed.
Disturbed.
Black job.
You guys are good at this. What about somebody who has drug issues? Addict. User. User and loser, thank you. Yep. So we describe them by their what they're doing, right? We describe them by their behavior. Another one that I hear a lot, right, is this idea of delinquent, that there's something wrong with them. Is that kind of what we hear? Is that what we understand? Delinquent? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So that is our current understanding of people who've experienced trauma. And that's what I'm going to challenge here today. So I want to warn you guys that my presentation's a little unique, right? Is that it's mostly pictures and I'm going to be telling you a story. Because I'm talking about trauma, some of the images may be a little upsetting, and some of the stuff in the story may be a little upsetting. I want you to know that this is a fictional story, but it is absolutely made up of the lives that I have worked with and the families that I've worked with for the last 10 years. All of this information and much more is true when we're working with families that have experienced trauma. My hope by the end of the presentation is that you have a better understanding of the complex process of human development and how some experiences literally get under our skin and influence how our brain and body develops and functions. I want to leave you wanting to know more, and I want to leave you with a sense of hope. Because I think when we change the way we think about how people are impacted by trauma, we have different ideas and we can have different outcomes, right? Okay, so let's move forward. This is the story of Alice. Her story is special, but you'll see today that it is not unique. Alice experienced several traumatic events or adverse childhood experiences during the early years of her life. These experiences do not define who she is or who she will become. Traumatic events do not impact all children equally. There are numerous factors involved. But we do know that early trauma can have lifelong health and behavioral consequences. But let me rewind just a little bit. You see, perhaps the single most important event in Alice's little life occurred before her mother even knew she was pregnant with her. At 5 weeks gestation, when Alice is the size of a sesame seed in her mother's womb, the tiny cells that will develop into the lobe and hemispheres of her brain start to divide and develop. Alice's brain is the organ responsible for her survival. And it has already started working and growing. And our brain and our body are learning and preparing for the world that we need to survive from the moment of conception on. From this moment on, the development of Alice's brain and body are influenced by 2 major factors. The first is her genome. Many of the characteristics that make Alice unique have been laid out in the blueprints of her genes. Her eye color, hair color, texture, personality traits, whether she's timid or outgoing, right? This and much more is wrapped up in the coded information of our genes. Alice has inherited the traits and characteristics from her parents and grandparents and great-grandparents that helped them survive successfully in a precarious environment, thus giving Alice the absolute best chance of surviving in a constantly changing world. But thanks to new research, we've learned that genes are not the only factor involved in our development. The second major factor influencing our development is our environment. And Alice's first environment is her mother's uterus. Her brain is already learning and responding to this environment. Alice can feel her mother's joy, stress, excitement, anger, and sadness. Alice's brain is at the mercy of her environment. What her mother experiences, Alice also experiences. Alice's brain responds to the brain chemicals, hormones, and any toxins, drugs, alcohol, or toxic stress that her mother experiences, Alice also experiences. Alice is learning valuable information about the world she will have to survive. We all remember the old nature versus nurture debate, right? Scientists and psychologists have long been arguing about which has more influence and importance on who we will become as adults. Scientists have done studies of twins separated at birth, raised in separate homes, and found that they still had remarkably similar mannerisms and personality traits, despite having entirely different environments, right? This research has made a strong case for the powerful influence of our genome. And we all know that our genes influence our health. This is why doctors and nurses ask us about our family history of high cholesterol, asthma, heart disease, and diabetes. We've also seen the research on twins, or we may, in our own lives, know a set of identical twins who were raised in the same home by the same parents, but are anything but identical. And this is why our doctor asks us about health risk behaviors. Do you smoke? How often do you eat fast food? How often do you exercise? Why does our doctor ask us both sets of questions? Because both our genes and our experiences in our environments matter. We now understand that when we're talking about health and the development of the brain and body, rather than nature versus nurture, it's better to think of human development as nature via nurture. Incredibly, there is scientific evidence that the expression of our genes can adapt, just like our brain, in response to our experiences in our environment. Scientists are uncovering evidence that the experience of your grandparents, whether positive or traumatic, like surviving the Holocaust or the Great Depression, like being a young Native American shipped off to a boarding school, or being an African American growing up in the Jim Crow South. These experiences have influenced the genes you inherited from your mother and father, thus giving you the best chance of surviving. But these adaptations may also be influencing your health. So now we see that for little Alice in her mother's womb, it is both her genes and her environment that are guiding the development of her brain and body. Brain development is most critical during the first 3 years of life. Exposure to toxic stress or adverse childhood experiences during these early years can have a profound impact on how our brain functions and develops. Brain development is much more complex and experience-dependent than we ever realized. Here we see the process of our brain cells reaching out and connecting through their roots or dendrites and making new connections as we have new experiences in our environment. We are born with the connections, over here, the little baby. We're born with the connections that we need to survive. What do babies need to do at birth? They need to eat, sleep, regulate their body temperature, digest food, cry, and they need to be able to connect with a caregiver. You show an infant a human face at birth, they identify it differently than any other object in the world. Why? Because even as a baby, we understand that our survival is dependent upon connection with another person. During childhood, our roots and branches reach out in all directions, and we learn new skills and develop new abilities. Repetition is how our brain learns whether the connection between brain cells is important for survival or not. The roots and branches that are not used frequently to carry messages between brain cells slowly recede, while our brain focuses on making the connections that we use regularly faster and stronger. So every time Alice cries and her mother picks her up, rocks her to and fro, and soothes her, sings her favorite song, they listen to music together, sit in a chair and rock back and forth. Each time they make eye contact, or Alice sees her mother smile, her brain is flooded with chemicals, like dopamine, and she's filled with feelings of joy, happiness, safety, and security. Alice begins to learn about her environment through these interactions with her mother, father, or primary caregiver. As Alice and her mother settle into a routine, so do the brain cells in her brain settle into a routine or pattern. And these connections between the brain cells grow stronger and faster with repetition. Alice's brain is literally changing and making the connections dependent upon her interactions with her primary caregiver and the experiences she has in her environment. But not all experiences are equal. And it is through this perspective that we must consider the influence of traumatic stress or adverse childhood experiences. Alice's mother and father both loved her very much. Her father was a gentle giant, the most loving and caring person to both her and her mother when he was sober. But when he was drunk, he just kind of lost all control. He would yell and scream. Her parents would verbally fight, and she would try anything to hide from the situation, in her room, in her closet, under her bed. Alice's brain is flooded with the stress hormones of adrenaline and cortisol. Sustained or frequent activation of our body's stress response system, the fight, flight, or freeze response, can lead to impairments in our learning, our memory, decrease our immune system functioning, and reduce our ability to regulate our emotions. Remember, Alice's brain is learning and developing based on her experiences in the environment. Repeated exposure to domestic violence, even if Alice is not in the room or physically harmed during the incident, can have a profound impact on her brain and developing body, and her future health. One night, the verbal arguing turns physical, and her father assaults her mother. Her father's arrested, and he does not return to the home. Alice's mother just kind of shuts down. Alice tries to make her mother laugh and smile. She wants to play with her mom, and they still do have lots of fun, right? But it seems to take all of her mom's energy just to get out of bed. Alice's brain experiences her mother's depression as a stressful event. Alice tries desperately to get her mother's attention and to get back that same sort of give and take relationship that she had with her mom as a baby. But when her mom's depression continues, Alice's brain is repeatedly flooded with those stress hormones. This is what is known as toxic stress, and it can change the anatomy of our brain and how it functions. Remember, our brain cells are reaching out and making connections with each other throughout much of childhood, even into our adulthood. Brain development is sequential and experience dependent, meaning that there are sensitive periods when our brain naturally helps us develop certain abilities and skills if we have the necessary experiences to encourage brain growth. Toddlers, for example, learn to walk and talk if parents and caregivers are talking to them, reading them books, and encouraging physical development. Brain research tells us that maltreatment, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, or witnessing domestic violence, during the first 3 years of life can have a profound impact on how our brain processes certain kinds of information, affecting our ability to focus or pay attention, how we understand social cues and even language, and our ability to regulate our hormones, mood, and even our heartbeat. Thankfully, we know that there's amazing stuff like home visiting nursing programs that do an exceptional job of building these skills in children through empowering, educating, and supporting their parents. Preschoolers learn to share, identify their feelings and the feelings of others when we give them opportunities for social and emotional growth. Brain science shows that abuse and neglect during the first 5 to 6 years of life can have significant impacts on how our brain solves problems, especially our ability to calm down and talk through a situation. Free, high-quality, early education services like Ready for K, Head Start, Early Head Start, and all-day kindergarten offer children structured opportunities to build social skills and resiliency. Elementary and middle school children, by this age, they're learning new skills almost every single day. They become less clumsy, more aware of their movements, their emotions, and they start to solve complex problems. Bullying, so verbal abuse, from parents or from peers, during this stage of development, our middle school years, can have significant impacts leading to increased anxiety, depression, increased anger and hostility, disassociation where we just kind of check out, and increased drug use. Local education leaders are working hard, reconsidering school discipline practices, and supporting our schools with incorporating what's called social and emotional learning. Social and emotional learning are the skills necessary to understand and manage our emotions, set and achieve positive goals for our own future, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. By the time we are teenagers, our brain begins to prune itself, focusing on maintaining the connections that are most important for our survival. Our brain is maximizing its efficiency, and it decides what's important based on our repeated experiences in our environment. However, our brains are amazing and continue to adapt and grow throughout our entire lives. We can regrow branches later in life. But learning new skills can be much more challenging if we miss out on the sensitive period of brain growth. Anyone here who's tried to learn a complex skill like playing a musical instrument as an adult or speaking a foreign language has felt this pain, right? So you see, Alice's brain will make the connections that she needs in order to survive. If her world is chaotic and filled with stress, she will make the connections that give her the best chance of surviving in a chaotic and stressful world. Learning to respond quickly to perceived danger. Areas of her brain responsible for complex mental functioning like planning, organizing, prioritizing, regulating her emotions, memory, and decision-making. These will become secondary. Alice learns to be hyper-aware of her environment, responding quickly to anything she perceives as dangerous. Because Alice's mother is depressed, she stops making Alice lunch, and she gives her money for fast food instead. Alice's mother just doesn't seem to have the energy to prepare meals, and besides, Alice loves McDonald's, right? Incredibly, eating fast food actually seems to make Alice feel better, happier, more relaxed, at least temporarily. This is an example of what I refer to as neurological self-care, or what Dr. Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti of the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study refer to as a personal solution to a traumatic experience. Alice feels better with each delicious bite of her Big Mac because her brain is flooded with feel-good chemicals. These chemicals are released after eating foods high in fat and sugar. They enhance our calmness, our mental concentration, our alertness, improve our mood, and lessen our depression. Anybody want another donut? Right? Alice's favorite class is music. She loves listening to music, humming, singing, learning to play an instrument. Making music is a powerful tool for building our brains. Playing music involves multiple senses. It requires our body movement and stimulates brain development. It can really improve brain functioning in the areas of higher level thinking or executive skill functioning. Things like planning, organizing, and decision making. Music also has an amazing ability to affect us at an emotional level, activating the same reward system in our brain that gets activated when we use drugs or alcohol, and filling us with those feel-good chemicals. Music is neurological self-care. Alice also loves playing soccer. She feels better when she's running around on the field with her friends. Physical activity increases blood flow and oxygen to the brain, encourages brain growth, and being physically active is especially important for learning new information and skills and for developing our memory. Physical activity benefits our brain overall, especially important for, again, those executive skill functions like problem solving, regulating our emotions, and our ability to generalize. Generalize is this really complex mental task where we learn information yesterday and apply it to a new situation today. But remember, when it comes to our brains and our bodies, not all experiences are the same. Unfortunately, Alice's mother could not maintain the house on her income alone. She works long hours, but she only earns minimum wage and struggles to make ends meet. Alice's mother has a series of not very nice boyfriends who live in the home and help the family out financially. Each one seems a little bit worse than the last. Then, when she's 13 years old, her mother's last boyfriend molests her. Her mother comes home from work, recognizes something is wrong, and immediately kicks him out. She promises to keep Alice safe and to never let another man hurt either one of them again. Alice starts to struggle in school. She can't seem to pay attention or stay focused. Her teachers think she may have ADHD. They're frustrated that Alice can never remember to turn in her homework, even though she usually has it done and she's a smart student. Alice's mother is overcome with the guilt for the sexual abuse that has occurred. She tries to cope with her loneliness and depression with her own personal solution of drinking alcohol. Her mother's drinking gets worse. She starts struggling at work, showing up late, calling in sick. Eventually, she loses her job. Alice and her mother end up homeless for a couple of weeks until they move into a shelter. Alice is teased and bullied at school because her friends notice that she's always in the same clothes. Bullying during the middle school years can have similar impacts on our brain functioning and our long-term health as sexual abuse early in life. Words matter. Alice still loves to play music, but when her mother loses her job, she can't afford an instrument or lessons anymore. So Alice had to quit. Alice continues to find comfort in eating, but now she also hates the attention she gets for her developing body. Ever since she was abused, Alice feels like men are looking at her, and she continues to gain weight. She stops playing soccer too. She hates running around on the field in the short shorts, having boys whistle or look her way. On a dare, Alice and some of her friends try smoking cigarettes together. Her friends quit after a week or two because they hate the taste. But Alice has found another personal solution to help her cope with her trauma. Cigarettes have a soothing effect on Alice's brain. Smoking seems to help Alice focus in school too. She feels more calm because nicotine causes the release of chemicals in our brain that result in improved concentration, alertness, improved memory, decreased feelings of pain and anxiety. Anybody ready for a smoke, right? So our childhood experiences help to form the foundation of our life. Alice's story is special, but remember it's not unique. In fact, over 60% of people here in Washington State have one or more adverse childhood experiences. ACEs are common, and they're highly interrelated. When there's one in the life of a child, there tend to be others. There are 10 adverse childhood experience categories, and these ACEs are like the bricks in a foundation, and they stack on top of one another. The 10 categories are physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then 5 categories of what the original researchers called household dysfunction. So growing up in a home where a parent, caregiver has mental health issues, a parent or caregiver was incarcerated, substance abuse issues, domestic violence, and divorce. The effects of ACEs are cumulative. The more ACEs a person experiences during childhood, the greater his or her risk for social, emotional, mental, and physical health problems throughout the lifespan. The strength of our foundation matters. So let's take a moment and look at Alice's ACE score. Her mother was depressed. In Kitsap County, over 60% of us have at least one adverse childhood experience. She witnessed domestic violence between her parents and then also between her mother and several of her mother's partners. 87% of people with one adverse childhood experience will have another. Alice was sexually abused. In Kitsap County, 35 to 40% of us have experienced 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Her father was incarcerated. Over half of the juveniles in detention, whom we describe as troubled kids or delinquents, have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Alice's mother and father struggled with alcohol use. 65% of the alcoholism that we see in our community today is associated with ACEs. Alice's mother and father were separated after he was arrested, and he never returned to the home, although he did maintain a relationship with Alice and they still had contact. Alice's ACE score is 6. 1 out of every 5 individuals have an ACE score of 6 or more. Alice and others with 6 or more ACEs are 9 times more likely to experience life dissatisfaction. ACEs reliably predict mental, physical, behavioral health challenges, relationship disruption, challenges with executive skill functioning or higher level thinking, difficulty with our work, managing our finances, and a decreased sense of hope and belonging and happiness. The effects of ACEs can also make parenting much more difficult. Thanks to the addictive quality of cigarettes and the effect that nicotine has on our brain, it's easy to see how this personal solution for some can become a lifelong health risk behavior. Alice's score of 6 or more means she is 4.6 times more likely to have chronic diseases and engage in risky health behaviors like smoking. Alice is 3.9 times more likely to develop chronic lung disease. Again, the effects on our brains of eating foods high in fat and sugar, combined with an ACE score of 6 or more, means she's 1.6 times more likely to become morbidly obese. She's 6 times more likely to struggle with alcoholism. She's twice as likely to report poor quality of sleep. She's 3 times more likely to be unable to work or have significantly disrupted days at work due to adverse childhood experiences. Of all the adults in our community right now reporting difficulty working or performing their daily life tasks, over 60% of this is related to adverse childhood experiences. Depression is the leading cause of disability in America, and 69% of all mental illness that we see in our community is associated with ACEs. Alice and others with 6 or more ACEs are 10 times more likely to inject IV drugs. She's 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. 80% of suicide that we see in our community is associated with ACEs. Sadly, people with 4 or more ACEs live on average 20 years less than people with an ACE score of 0. 85% of people experiencing homelessness in our community have at least one adverse childhood experience. 59% have 4 or more. And 1/3 of people like Alice who have an ACE score of 6 or more will experience homelessness at some point in their life. It shouldn't be a surprise that over 95% of the juveniles in detention have an ACE score of 1 or more. In fact, 50% have an ACE score of 4 or more. Despite the increased risk of lifelong health consequences associated with ACEs, early adversity is not a guarantee for negative outcomes. For Alice, and for each one of us here in this room today, the impact that ACEs have had in our lives is largely dependent upon our resiliency. Resiliency is our ability to overcome life's challenges and bounce back. Remember, our brain is responsible for survival, and our brain adapts to our experiences in our environment to help us survive. But this is not the same thing as thriving or being resilient. Resiliency is not an individual characteristic that some people have and others do not. No flower or weed blooms on its own. We may not see it or pay attention to it, but the flower needs water, sun, and nutrients from the soil in order to grow. Resiliency is a skill that we develop through the experiences we have in our life and through our relationships with caring and competent people. We're learning that focusing on building resiliency in all people, especially for those with high ACE scores, can have incredible positive effects and help everyone in our community strengthen their foundation. Encouraging all children and adults to pursue their unique passions and talents and develop their individual skills increases resiliency and improves our health. When we know that we're good at something, we feel proud about our abilities, we tell ourselves that we have value. Just thinking and feeling this way, even if it's not true, improves our health outcomes regardless of our ACE score. Remember that our words matter. This is a drawing from an individual at age 13 and then again at age 17. Simple words of encouragement, the support of a teacher, or the warm smile of a proud parent and a prominent place on the fridge can determine whether we discover and develop our talents or not. When people feel socially and emotionally supported and hopeful about the future, they do better. Even people with high ACE scores have better health outcomes if they have a high level of support and hope. Having 2 or more people who you can rely on when you are in need, or when you need help, builds our resiliency and improves our health. And living in a community where you feel safe and connected, watching out for each other's children, doing favors, it really is true. It takes a village. And when communities believe that child safety and well-being is everyone's responsibility, both children and adults living in that community do better. We don't know how Alice's story ends, because, in a large part, it matters where she lives. Whether her path leads to lifelong health issues and early death, or if Alice has access to the resources and opportunities for her to develop resiliency, depends on us. It depends on her community. Thankfully, we're already doing incredible things here in Kitsap County to improve outcomes for children and families and all individuals impacted by ACEs. There's amazing work going on in our community. Some of the great trauma-informed and resiliency-building work includes the Developmental Assets Training Initiative, where we're teaching children these building blocks to help them become more resilient. Crisis intervention training, where we're training our police officers how to respond to people who are having a mental health crisis, and to do that in a trauma-informed way. And Kitsap Strong is funding 26 local nonprofits to learn this information and research across the lifespan. We have daycare providers all the way up through hospice care to learn this information and to think critically about how does this mental model inform the way that they offer services to the clients that they serve. Kitsap Strong is working with local leaders to explore what more we can do when we all understand the connection between trauma, brain development, and our lifelong health and well-being. Together we can build foundations and systems that support us all. Why Kitsap Strong? The name came out of my thinking about how communities respond in the event of a crisis. Communities hold incredible potential, resources, and the capacity for compassion. Time and again, we are amazed by the capacity of ordinary people to respond in a moment of crisis. This is OSO, right? ACEs are a hidden crisis in our community. They're robbing our children and our adults of the opportunity to reach their full potential. Remember, over 60% of us in this room have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. But thankfully, most of us also had access to someone who told us we had value. We were good at something, and we were worthy of love. Not all children have someone. We, the community, can each do something. And that's my presentation. Thank you. So before we get into questions, I'm an extreme extrovert, right? You can tell that. But I want to give us just a second here for everybody who thinks differently. There's a piece of paper hopefully on your table. Turn around, write down, if this is how you process information. Just take a second here to think about one thing from my conversation here today that really resonated with you, that spoke to you. One thing that was maybe surprising for you, and then if you have a question, write down a question. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, okay? Sorry guys, I want to be respectful of your time so we can get out of here. But I love that there's this rich conversation going on right now. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. I'm very humbled by the opportunity to just be here and to be able to facilitate and participate in this conversation with you guys. So thank you for that. So I wanted to give us, I think we've got about 10 minutes here, is that right?
Yeah, 5, let's say 8 minutes. We gotta for sure be done by 1:45.
So we're going to have a couple of groups that want to share out, and then again we're going to continue this conversation next week, right? Also, a reminder, if you guys could fill out your evaluations, and at the bottom, if you want something specifically next time, if there's a really burning question, there's some additional information you really want to make sure that we cover next week, write it on there, okay? And I'll try and address it next week, okay? But why don't we have a couple couple of groups, again, this is totally voluntary, a couple of groups that want to share just the conversation that was just happening at your table, the things that really resonated with you from the conversation. Any volunteers that want to share with the large group? And we have some people with mics that'll wander around. This fine gentleman here is saying he's willing to share. Thank you. Right here, yeah.
Ken, you gonna talk? No, he made me do it. Well, certainly, I guess we were all pretty flabbergasted at the extent of the problem. We all know it's out there. And I guess once we thought about it, it's not, I guess it's not surprising on the other hand, the extent of it. We obviously all came up with the words that we know what,
Yep.
we all know what a tweaker is.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
That
yeah.
stuff. So, but there's just a lot of it out there. In observation or question, that certainly one I had was our whole system, I'd say system, economy, whatever, is built on functionals. I mean, it's all learning about functioning in society. Matter of fact, they just had a deal in Seattle in classrooms about kids. The solution is suspending all these kids. They can't behave in the classroom, they suspend them. So they looked around one day and they said, all the black kids are getting suspended. Well, so they're trying to deal with that over there. But I'm sure it goes on over here too.
It's a national problem.
Yeah, so that's the question. So now that we have a system, and in my industry, safety is a huge issue. If somebody shows up and they're impaired, you're fired. So if you flunk a drug test, you're out. And the cycle goes on. So there's a question for you.
That's a question for everyone, right? Because remember, and thank you for that, I appreciate the question, right? Remember that there is no expert in what do we do now, right? Because when Columbus got in that boat, right, there was no expert at the time, right? He was just daring and recognizing the reality of the situation was that there was enough evidence saying that the world was round, right? There's enough evidence now, and I think you summed it up great, right? There's enough evidence now that this is the reality. This is how trauma impacts our brains, and that it's much larger than we ever understood. But now, how does that change the way that our systems respond to the problem? If we stop thinking about it as the issue is there's some personal fault, and we look at it as there's an experience that individual didn't receive that they needed to develop their brain, then how does that change our response?
As in our group, we talked about the fact that the brain research has really been very, very important, and the fact that there are some wonderful programs within our county for Head Start and so on. But even with all that, how come our county is worse than it's ever been with this problem? And one of our points of discussion is that there's a lack of community here. I gave my own example of having two areas in my own family that supported almost all you said. One was church, that was our family home, and the other one was a social group. Mine happened to be the Sons of Norway. But I think if everybody had those communities that supported them, we would be better off. And I'm very glad that you brought up the asset building from Search Institute. I think that when I left my job 15 years ago, 16 years ago, this was really a big thing. I haven't heard much about it over the last few years. Maybe it's because I'm old and away from what's going on, but I see that as so important for our kids. And one of the asset things that we learned was if they have a church home, that one asset helps them a great deal as children.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. There's a lady back there in the back.
I love your presentation. I have learned so much. And thank you for coming. I'm just kind of wondering, Ken Day brought up something that just kind of made me think when he was talking about a situation where all the black kids were getting suspended. And I'm thinking, to me, do you think that falls under emotional abuse? Because racism can be considered, you know, when kids are all targeted, certain communities are targeted. Is that another ACE to think about adding? I'm just wondering.
You bring up a wonderful, wonderful question. And what we have now is the neuroscience to say that, yeah, that 10 categories, right, that doesn't encompass all the trauma that we can experience in our life, right? Even in that 10, in the story that I shared about Alice, homelessness, bullying, poverty, those weren't one of the 10 categories. Because the men who created those 10 categories, openly, were 2 white men in the early 1990s, and they were 2 white men who were focused on prevention. So they looked at research. What were we trying to prevent? We were trying to prevent divorce, child abuse and neglect. We were trying to prevent substance use. We were trying to prevent domestic violence. So that's how they created those 10 categories. But there is subsequent research from that original one that is added in all of the isms. Racism, sexism, ableism, right? The way we treat people based upon their physical abilities. All of those can impact us at a neurological level. And can be interpreted by our brains as stress. And absolutely they can impact us the same way. So there's other communities that have expanded that list much beyond 10. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but I look forward to continuing the conversation with this amazing community next week. And thank you again so much for the opportunity.
Before we put our hands together for our guest, be thinking about this. I am struck by the empathy that's created by learning about ACEs, but also the hope that there's places of intervention and help that we can do for our own kids and for our church kids and for the community. So I'm excited about what we can do with this when it comes to our mission. Let's thank Kody first.